Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt and her war against Rome. Cleopatra VII Philopator was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, a queen of unmatched intelligence, ambition, and political skill. Born in 69 BCE in Alexandria, she ruled at a time when Egypt was threatened by internal unrest and the rising dominance of Rome. Fluent in multiple languages and educated in philosophy, astronomy, and governance, Cleopatra was more than just a legendary beauty, she was a master strategist. Her powerful alliances and romantic partnerships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony shaped the course of history and challenged the very foundation of Roman authority. This is the full story of her rise, her reign, and her final stand against the Roman Empire. Do you believe Cleopatra was a brilliant political mastermind, or a ruler destroyed by love? This is Bio-Explainer, where you discover the complete biographies of the world's most fascinating historical figures. Subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. All references are listed in the video description. Narrated by Alessio. 1. Birth and historical background, 69 BCE. In 69 BCE, Cleopatra VII Philopator was born into one of the most powerful yet internally fragile dynasties of the Hellenistic world. Her birthplace was the grand city of Alexandria, Egypt, an epicenter of Mediterranean culture, philosophy, commerce, and power. Founded by Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier, Alexandria stood as a vibrant symbol of Greek influence embedded in the heart of North Africa. At the time of Cleopatra's birth, the city was home to an extraordinary mix of Egyptian tradition and Greek cosmopolitanism, fused under the political shadow of an increasingly aggressive Roman Republic. It was a city marked by contradictions. Towering Greek temples beside Egyptian pyramids, scrolls from Plato and Homer housed alongside ancient hieroglyphic papyri in the Library of Alexandria. Cleopatra's lineage was deeply rooted in the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal house that had ruled Egypt since 305 BCE, when Ptolemy Isota, one of Alexander's generals, declared himself pharaoh following the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. Over the generations, the Ptolemies had become notorious for dynastic intermarriage, conspiracies, and bloody succession struggles. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, known informally as the flute player, had a precarious grip on power. He was perceived as a weak and indulgent ruler, relying heavily on Roman bribes to maintain his throne. His reign was unstable, and by the time Cleopatra was a child, the Egyptian court was embroiled in both internal dissent and external manipulation from Rome. Cleopatra's mother's identity remains debated among historians, but it is widely believed she was either Cleopatra V Tryphena, possibly a sister or cousin of Ptolemy XII, or another woman of Macedonian Greek heritage. Regardless, Cleopatra inherited a royal bloodline that combined political tradition with deep dysfunction. She had several siblings, all of whom would play roles in the complex and often deadly theatre of succession. Most notable were her sisters Berenice IV and Arsinoe IV, and her two younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. The political climate of Cleopatra's early years was defined by anxiety and upheaval. Ptolemy XII faced popular discontent in Egypt due to his corruption and close ties with Rome. To secure Roman protection, he borrowed heavily and offered bribes to Roman senators, indebting the kingdom while alienating his own people. This dependency on Rome would define the fate of the dynasty and the future path of Cleopatra's life. The Romans, under leaders like Pompey and later Julius Caesar, were not merely allies, they were the kingmakers of the Mediterranean world. As Cleopatra grew up in the palace halls of Alexandria, she would have witnessed firsthand the delicate and often dangerous balance her father tried to maintain between Egyptian sovereignty and Roman authority. Yet even in such a volatile environment, Cleopatra showed signs of sharp intelligence and a talent for political survival. As a royal child raised at the crossroads of cultures, languages, and ideologies, she was being shaped not only to rule Egypt, but to navigate a world where every ally could become a threat, and every decision carried the weight of empires. 2. The Ptolemaic dynasty and education. The Ptolemaic court into which Cleopatra was born was both dazzling and deeply unstable. Its opulence masked a decaying power structure riddled with infighting, ritualized incest, and external dependency. Yet it remained one of the most intellectually vibrant courts in the ancient world, blending the legacy of classical Greek culture with Egyptian religious tradition and administrative sophistication. From an early age, Cleopatra was immersed in this dual world, Greek in lineage and language, Egyptian in territory and symbolic authority. Her Greek heritage was evident in her name itself. Cleopatra means glory of the father in Greek, a nod to the dynasty's continued cultural self-identification with their Macedonian roots rather than with native Egyptians. Unlike previous rulers in the Ptolemaic line, who distanced themselves from the native population and governed largely through Greek-speaking elites, Cleopatra would ultimately distinguish herself by bridging this divide. But as a child and young adolescent, she was trained within the framework of Hellenistic royal customs, preparing her to survive and rule in a court where intellect was as critical as bloodline. Cleopatra's education was exceptional even by royal standards. The Ptolemies placed a premium on learning, and Alexandria, with its world-famous library and museum, was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Scholars from across the Greek-speaking world converged there, philosophers, mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, poets, all supported by royal patronage. Within this milieu, Cleopatra received a rigorous classical education designed not only to sharpen her intellect but to prepare her for governance, diplomacy, and statecraft. Her curriculum likely included Homeric poetry, the works of Plato and Aristotle, political rhetoric, and practical governance. She studied medicine, economics, geometry, and military strategy, subjects essential for a monarch who would be expected to lead not merely through ceremonial duties but through direct engagement with matters of state. One of the most striking features of her education, however, was her training in languages. While most Ptolemies learned only Greek and used interpreters to communicate with their Egyptian subjects, Cleopatra became fluent in Egyptian, a symbolic and strategic move that aligned her more closely with the native population. In fact, ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra was proficient in as many as 9 languages. In addition to Greek and Egyptian, she may have spoken Aramaic, Latin, Ethiopian, Parthian, Hebrew, Median, and Arabic. This linguistic command allowed her to speak directly with foreign envoys and regional leaders without intermediaries, an extraordinary diplomatic asset in a world defined by regional rivalries and fragile alliances. Cleopatra's embrace of Egyptian religion and culture also set her apart from her predecessors. Whereas earlier Ptolemies had adopted the formal title of Pharaoh but made little effort to integrate with the native traditions, Cleopatra actively styled herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. This was not merely ceremonial. By aligning herself with Egyptian religious identity, she was making a calculated political statement, positioning herself not just as a foreign occupier but as a legitimate native ruler. Court life, meanwhile, was a crucible of power games and betrayals. Even as she pursued her studies, Cleopatra would have been keenly aware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the palace. Royal siblings were as much rivals as they were kin, and survival depended on vigilance, alliances, and timing. As she matured into her teens, Cleopatra began to demonstrate a sharp understanding of these dynamics. Her intellect, adaptability, and emotional intelligence began to distinguish her from her siblings, setting the stage for her eventual rise. By the time she was a teenager, Cleopatra had internalized the critical lessons of leadership in an unstable world, the value of charisma, the necessity of alliances, the dangers of dependence on foreign powers, and the importance of cultivating loyalty among both elites and commoners. These were not theoretical principles, they were tools for survival, sharpened by the examples of fallen queens and betrayed brothers. Cleopatra's formative years were thus a convergence of privilege and peril. She was raised in a palace of marble and mosaics, surrounded by texts from Aristotle and artifacts from ancient pharaohs, tutored by the finest minds of the time, and trained in the arts of persuasion, calculation, and command. But this world was also built on crumbling foundations. The grandeur of the Ptolemaic court masked its decay, and within that contradiction, Cleopatra learned the hardest truths of leadership, that survival required both brilliance and ruthlessness, and that power, once gained, could never be safely put down. Welcome to BioExplainer, the channel where you discover the biographies of the most important historical figures. If you enjoy this kind of content, you're in the right place. We'd love to get to know you. Tell us where and when you're watching or listening from. Do you have a favorite historical figure? Let us know in the comments, and we'll create a biography video about them. 3. Family tensions and the death of Ptolemy XII, 51 BCE. By the final decade of Ptolemy XII Orleans' rule, the Kingdom of Egypt was straining under the burden of foreign debt, domestic unrest, and internal royal discord. Ptolemy XII had spent much of his reign desperately trying to buy the favor of Roman senators, particularly the powerful triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus and Pompey the Great. To secure their support, he mortgaged Egypt's future, sending vast sums of gold to Rome while imposing heavy taxes on his own people. These actions made him deeply unpopular in Alexandria and beyond, and eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. In 58 BCE, Ptolemy XII was driven from Egypt by a revolt in Alexandria. His eldest daughter, Berenice IV, took the opportunity to claim the throne in his absence. She ruled as queen for 3 years while her father wandered in exile across the Mediterranean, seeking assistance from his Roman patrons. Cleopatra, who was around 11 years old at the time, accompanied him for part of this exile. This experience was critical. She observed firsthand how her father interacted with Roman officials, how he negotiated, pleaded, and maneuvered within the complex power structures of the Republic. It gave her a close look at the fragility of her father's authority and the dominance Rome exerted over even ancient monarchies. Ptolemy XII eventually secured Roman military assistance, reportedly with a bribe of 6,000 talents of silver, approximately 198 metric tons or £437,000. With Roman troops at his back, he marched back into Alexandria in 55 BCE and retook his throne. Berenice IV was captured and executed, a clear message to any family member who might consider rebellion. Though Cleopatra was not directly involved in the conflict, the brutal fate of her sister underscored the mortal stakes of dynastic politics in Egypt. The restored reign of Ptolemy XII was even more beholden to Rome than before. Roman garrisons were stationed in Egypt to protect his interests, and Egyptian autonomy continued to erode under Roman influence. In this climate, Cleopatra began to position herself carefully within the royal hierarchy. She kept a low profile while cultivating the loyalty of palace administrators and religious leaders, who still held sway among the native Egyptian population. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy XII died. According to his will, allegedly drafted with the guidance or coercion of Roman officials, Cleopatra was named co-regent alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10 years old. The will specified that they were to rule jointly as husband and wife, following the long-standing Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriages. Though common among the dynasty, these unions were largely symbolic and served to reinforce dynastic legitimacy rather than reflect actual domestic arrangements. At just 18 years old, Cleopatra assumed the throne of a kingdom in crisis. The Nile was experiencing erratic flooding, leading to food shortages. Civil unrest simmered beneath the surface. The treasury was depleted, and Rome's shadow loomed larger than ever. Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, was too young to rule independently, which meant that actual governance would fall on her shoulders. However, power in the Ptolemaic court rarely rested peacefully. Within months of their ascension, factions within the palace began coalescing around each sibling, setting the stage for a fierce rivalry that would define the next phase of Cleopatra's life. Key among her opponents was the eunuch Pothinus, who acted as regent for the boy king and resented Cleopatra's growing assertiveness. Pothinus, along with the general Achilles and the scholar Theodotus of Chios, began to sideline Cleopatra from decisions of state, undermining her authority in the name of preserving her brother's position. They viewed Cleopatra's intelligence, independence, and close relationship with the Egyptian priesthood as threats to their influence over the young monarch. By the end of 51 BCE, it was clear that the joint rule was unsustainable. Cleopatra's early attempts at independent diplomacy, such as her outreach to foreign powers and control of key provinces, only intensified the rift between her and the regents of Ptolemy XIII. She continued to issue decrees in her own name, without her brothers, and appeared alone on coinage, an unmistakable symbol of sovereignty. The royal court had once again become a battlefield, not of swords, but of loyalties, titles, and decrees. Cleopatra, though young, had inherited not only a throne but a legacy of family betrayal and Roman dependency. The death of her father had not ended the dynastic turbulence, it had merely handed her the challenge of surviving it. 4. Struggle for power and exile, 49 BCE. The uneasy co-regency between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII quickly deteriorated into open conflict. By 49 BCE, just 2 years after assuming the throne, Cleopatra found herself the target of a political coup orchestrated by Pothinus and his allies. The young king's advisors, concerned with Cleopatra's growing independence and authority, moved decisively to remove her from power. They exploited traditionalist sentiments at court, portraying Cleopatra as overstepping her role and threatening the dynastic order. The propaganda worked. Support for Ptolemy XIII swelled among palace insiders, and Cleopatra was soon forced out of Alexandria. Exiled from the royal capital, Cleopatra fled to the eastern regions of Egypt, likely seeking refuge in the province of the Bade or near Pelusium, a city close to the eastern border with Syria. She did not retreat passively. Even in exile, Cleopatra began gathering support for a counteroffensive. Drawing on her political instincts and understanding of regional dynamics, she recruited an army composed of local loyalists and foreign mercenaries. Reports from the period suggest she also sought support from Nabatean Arabia and other eastern allies who had reason to oppose Roman-backed regimes or had past relationships with the Ptolemaic court. Meanwhile, Ptolemy XII's regime was consolidating control in Alexandria, but internal tensions persisted. The regents were young, ambitious, and prone to factional disputes. The situation became more precarious when the Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey spilled into Egyptian territory. Pompey, once a close ally of Ptolemy XII and thus familiar with Egypt's politics, fled to Egypt after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. The regents of Ptolemy XIII, seeking to ingratiate themselves with Caesar, decided to execute Pompey upon his arrival, beheading him and presenting the severed head to Caesar as a supposed gesture of loyalty. Their plan backfired spectacularly. Caesar was reportedly appalled by the brutality and dishonor of the act, especially since Pompey had once been a consul of Rome and his son-in-law. Though Caesar was at war with Pompey, he believed in Roman dignity and proper treatment of noble enemies. The murder only deepened his suspicion toward Ptolemy XII's court and heightened his interest in stabilizing the region, under terms more favorable to Rome and himself. As Caesar entered Alexandria in pursuit of Pompey's remains and greater influence over Egypt, Cleopatra saw an opportunity. Understanding Caesar's personality and ambitions, she planned an extraordinary move to reinsert herself into the political game. With Alexandria under hostile control, she could not enter the city openly. Instead, she arranged to be smuggled into the palace concealed in a sack or rolled inside a carpet, a dramatic gesture that has since become legend. Whether fact or myth, the story underscores Cleopatra's willingness to risk everything and employ both wit and spectacle to achieve her goals. The moment Cleopatra was unrolled before Caesar was not only a personal gamble, it was a calculated political strike. She recognized Caesar's ego, his respect for intelligence, and his desire to shape the fate of kingdoms. Cleopatra presented herself as a rightful queen wronged by treacherous regents and as a potential partner in restoring order. She appealed not only to his politics but to his curiosity and sense of drama. This private meeting marked a turning point in her life and in the history of Egypt. While she had yet to reclaim her throne by force, Cleopatra had re-entered the arena not as an exiled claimant but as a woman capable of maneuvering among the most powerful men of the era. The struggle for Egypt was no longer a mere family feud, it had become entangled in the broader contest for control of the Roman world. With Caesar's arrival and Cleopatra's bold reappearance in Alexandria, the dynastic conflict would soon erupt into open war, setting the stage for a new and decisive phase in her reign. 5. Meeting Julius Caesar and return to power, 48 BCE. Cleopatra's fateful meeting with Julius Caesar in Alexandria in 48 BCE reshaped not only her destiny but the geopolitical future of the Eastern Mediterranean. After her dramatic arrival in the palace, whether wrapped in a rug or concealed in a linen sack, the queen confronted one of Rome's most powerful and enigmatic men. Caesar, a general, statesman, and ambitious reformer, was nearing the peak of his influence. His civil war with Pompey had left him the dominant figure in Roman politics, and Cleopatra recognized the opportunity to ally herself with a force capable of restoring her power. The details of their first private discussions are lost to history, but ancient accounts agree that Cleopatra quickly impressed Caesar with her intelligence, political acumen, and command of languages. Unlike the traditional image of Cleopatra as merely a seductress, it was her diplomacy, her fluency in both Greek and Egyptian, and her deep understanding of statecraft that earned Caesar's respect. She did not come as a supplicant but as a sovereign offering a mutually beneficial alliance. She knew Egypt's wealth and strategic location were valuable to Caesar, and she positioned herself as the key to controlling both. Ptolemy XIII and his regents were incensed to discover Cleopatra had gained Caesar's favor. Fearing they were losing control, they mobilized their troops and surrounded the royal quarter in Alexandria, where Caesar was staying. This sparked the Alexandrian War, a brutal urban conflict marked by street battles, sieges, and arson. Caesar's forces, although smaller in number, were better trained and equipped. Reinforcements eventually arrived from Asia Minor, and after months of fighting, the tide turned. The war culminated in the decisive Battle of the Nile in early 47 BCE. Ptolemy XII's forces were defeated, and during the chaotic retreat, the teenage king reportedly drowned while trying to escape across the river. With her primary rival dead, Cleopatra was reinstalled as queen with Caesar's full backing. Following dynastic custom, she was required to rule alongside a male co-regent. She selected her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12 years old, as the nominal partner in governance. In reality, Cleopatra ruled alone, and Ptolemy XIV held no real power. Cleopatra and Caesar's political partnership soon evolved into a personal relationship. While in Alexandria, Caesar remained in the palace as Cleopatra's guest for several months, far longer than Roman tradition considered proper. During this period, Cleopatra gave birth to a son named Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, more commonly known as Caesar Ion. Though Caesar never publicly acknowledged him, Cleopatra made it clear that Caesar Ion was the son of the Roman dictator, presenting him as the heir not only to the Egyptian throne but potentially to Caesar's legacy. The implications of this were enormous. If Caesar Ion were ever recognized in Rome, he could rival Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. Cleopatra's ambitions for her son were rooted in a blend of dynastic tradition and strategic foresight. She envisioned an Egypt that remained independent, with a lineage that linked the ancient pharaohs to the future rulers of the Mediterranean world. With the war in Alexandria concluded, Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE, but not before granting Cleopatra significant autonomy. Her position was now secure, and Egypt remained a technically independent kingdom, although increasingly aligned with Roman interests. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar for part of the journey, eventually making her way to Rome with Caesar Ion and a large entourage. In Rome, Cleopatra's presence was both celebrated and scandalous. She took up residence in a villa in the Horti Caesaris, Caesar's private gardens across the Tiber. Her arrival was a sensation. Romans were fascinated and unsettled by her. She wore Egyptian clothing, styled herself as Isis, and lived with Caesar's apparent approval despite his marriage to Calpurnia. Senators and aristocrats whispered about her influence, her foreign customs, and the child she claimed was Caesar's. While Caesar focused on reforms and consolidating power, Cleopatra remained in the background of Roman political life. Yet her symbolic presence spoke volumes. She embodied the tensions between East and West, monarchy and republic, woman and empire. Her alliance with Caesar had restored her throne, but it also placed her at the center of a storm gathering over the Roman world. Back in Alexandria, she had not only secured her power but begun to reimagine the Ptolemaic monarchy. With Roman protection and her own vision for dynastic continuity, Cleopatra stood ready to guide Egypt into a new era, an era that would soon be appended by the most violent shift in Roman history. 6. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship, 47 to 44 BCE. Cleopatra's time in Rome was unlike anything that had been seen before. A queen of one of the wealthiest and oldest civilizations had come to the capital of the young but rapidly expanding Roman Republic, not as a prisoner or an ally under obligation, but as a sovereign monarch and the companion of its most powerful man. Her presence challenged Roman sensibilities. In a city where tradition was tightly guarded, Cleopatra embodied foreignness, monarchy, and female authority, all wrapped in luxury and exotic prestige. She resided in Caesar's private estate across the Tiber River, in a villa surrounded by lush gardens, fountains, and sculptures. Though she held no official role in Roman government, her arrival caused widespread speculation. Caesar's decision to allow Cleopatra and her entourage to live so prominently within Roman territory was seen by many as a troubling sign of his disregard for republican values. The Roman aristocracy, already alarmed by Caesar's consolidation of power, viewed his association with Cleopatra as part of a larger pattern of monarchical behavior. Cleopatra, for her part, navigated Roman society carefully. She made few public appearances, likely understanding the depth of cultural tension surrounding her. But her influence was undeniable. Caesar placed a golden statue of her, depicted as the goddess Isis, inside the temple of Venus Genetrix, a controversial gesture that elevated her status while implicitly linking her divine image with Rome's own mythological ancestry. For many Romans, especially traditionalists in the Senate, this crossed a line. Caesar was accused of abandoning Roman virtue in favor of Eastern decadence and autocratic tendencies. Amid this growing political discomfort, Cleopatra's position remained ambiguous but potent. She was a foreign queen in the heart of a republic, with the ear of its most powerful citizen and the child of that union at her side. Caesar Ion, though a toddler, became a symbolic figure, unofficially presented by Cleopatra as Caesar's heir. This claim undermined the standing of Caesar's grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, later Augustus, who had been named in Caesar's will as his legal successor. Although Caesar never formally recognized Caesar Ion in Roman legal documents, Cleopatra's public portrayal of him as the son of a living god fed speculation and deepened Rome's anxieties about succession and monarchy. For Cleopatra, Rome was both opportunity and threat. She saw the potential to anchor Egypt's future through alliance with Caesar, but she was also aware of the dangers. Her court continued to function in Alexandria under the nominal rule of Ptolemy XIV, but the real decisions were made either in Rome or by envoys working in both capitals. Cleopatra maintained a careful correspondence with Egyptian officials and priests during her time abroad, ensuring the temples remained loyal and the provinces calm. In early 44 BCE, Caesar was declared Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. For some Romans, this was the final proof that the Republic was dying. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, in an effort to preserve the old order. Cleopatra was still in Rome at the time, and the news sent shockwaves through her camp. The assassination left Cleopatra in an uncertain position. Without Caesar's protection, her presence in Rome became politically dangerous. She quickly decided to return to Egypt with Caesar Ion, likely recognizing that the power vacuum in Rome could quickly become hostile. She departed quietly, leaving behind a city on the brink of civil war and a legacy of controversy that would haunt her son. Upon her return to Alexandria, Cleopatra found herself once again at the center of political transition. Ptolemy XIV, who had ruled with her in name only, soon died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by Cleopatra. With his death, she installed Caesar Ion as co-regent, naming him Ptolemy XV Caesar. Now ruling officially with her son, Cleopatra began to shape Egypt's future with renewed energy and determination. The Roman world plunged into chaos. Caesar's death sparked a power struggle between his assassins and supporters, leading to the rise of the Second Triumvirate composed of Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's fate would once again hinge on Roman politics. As always, she prepared carefully, watching from Alexandria, strengthening her hold over Egypt, and waiting for the moment when she would re-enter the Roman stage, this time through a new alliance that would define the next and final phase of her reign. 7. Power consolidation in Egypt. Following her return from Rome and the sudden death of Ptolemy XIV, almost certainly orchestrated under her command, Cleopatra assumed full control over the Egyptian throne. For the first time, she reigned not as a co-ruler with a male sibling but as the supreme sovereign, with her son Caesar Ion installed as nominal co-regent. Cleopatra was now in her mid-20s, a seasoned political survivor with deep knowledge of both Eastern and Western power structures. The experience she had gained in Rome, combined with the lessons of her father's court, equipped her to steer Egypt through one of its most precarious periods. Cleopatra immediately began reinforcing her authority. She embarked on a series of administrative reforms to stabilize the economy, which had been strained by years of conflict, tribute payments to Rome, and inconsistent Nile flooding. Grain production, the backbone of the Egyptian economy, was prioritized. Cleopatra invested in irrigation improvements and tightened control over the grain trade, particularly shipments bound for Rome. Egypt's ability to feed the Roman population had always been one of its most valuable diplomatic tools, and Cleopatra ensured that Alexandria's grain fleet remained indispensable. She also restructured the tax system to generate more reliable revenue for the royal treasury. The collection of taxes, previously managed by a mix of local bureaucrats and private contractors, was reorganized to improve oversight and reduce corruption. Cleopatra understood that a strong fiscal foundation was necessary not only to fund her government but also to project strength toward both internal rivals and Roman envoys. In religious matters, Cleopatra carefully cultivated support from Egypt's powerful priesthood. She continued to identify herself with the goddess Isis, a strategy that blended religious devotion with political propaganda. Through ritual appearances at temples, dedications to sacred deities, and generous donations to religious institutions, she reaffirmed her image as the legitimate and divinely sanctioned ruler of Egypt. The temples, particularly those in Upper Egypt, portrayed her in traditional pharaonic style, wearing the vulture headdress, holding the ankh, and standing beside deities. This symbolic alignment with Egypt's spiritual heritage earned her the loyalty of native populations and set her apart from her Greek predecessors, who had largely ruled as outsiders. In parallel, she maintained the intellectual and cosmopolitan traditions of Alexandria. Cleopatra continued to sponsor scholars, poets, and scientists, preserving the legacy of the library and museum. Though Rome had become the political center of the Mediterranean, Alexandria remained a beacon of learning and culture under her reign. Her rule was also marked by a sophisticated use of imagery and coinage. Cleopatra ensured that her likeness was distributed throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in the form of silver tetradrachms and bronze drachmas, minted with her profile in a style that echoed classical Greek portraiture but included uniquely Egyptian elements. These coins served as instruments of soft power, projecting her image across borders and reinforcing her presence in the daily lives of her subjects and allies. At the diplomatic level, Cleopatra treaded carefully. While consolidating power at home, she avoided overt provocations against Rome. She remained in regular contact with Roman officials, offering symbolic gestures of cooperation while refusing to yield any real sovereignty. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's survival depended on maintaining a precarious balance between independence and strategic alignment with Rome. This period of consolidation also saw significant investment in infrastructure. Cleopatra funded the restoration of temples, improved harbor facilities in Alexandria, and supported trade across the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. Egypt's commercial network stretched deep into Africa and across to Arabia and the Indian subcontinent. These trade routes brought exotic goods, incense, ivory, spices, pearls, and positioned Egypt as an essential hub in global commerce. Perhaps most significantly, Cleopatra ruled with a sense of long-term vision. Her court educated Caesar Ion not only in Egyptian traditions but in Roman customs and language. She raised him not as a provincial ruler but as a prince who could one day contend on a larger stage. Through Caesar Ion, Cleopatra hoped to create a dynastic bridge between East and West, between the old pharaonic legacy and the rising Roman world. Yet even as Cleopatra strengthened her rule and rebuilt Egypt's foundations, the wider Roman world was descending into chaos. The fragile alliance of the Second Triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, was unraveling. Battles were being fought not only across Roman provinces but within the Senate and the streets of Rome itself. Cleopatra watched carefully, understanding that the coming power struggle in the West would once again pull Egypt into its orbit. She would need to choose a side. When the opportunity came, it arrived not as an edict or an invasion, but as a summons, an invitation from Mark Antony to meet him in Tarsus. Cleopatra accepted. She understood that the next chapter of her reign, and possibly the fate of her kingdom, would be written not in the temples of Egypt or the markets of Alexandria, but in the political theater of Rome's military elite. And this time, she would meet her Roman counterpart not as a guest or a widow, but as a queen prepared to negotiate power on her own terms. 8. Alliance with Mark Antony, 41 BCE. The meeting between Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 41 BCE was a defining moment in both of their lives and a pivotal episode in the struggle for control of the post-Caesar Roman world. Mark Antony, one of Julius Caesar's most trusted generals and a member of the Second Triumvirate, had been assigned the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic following the defeat of Caesar's assassins. With power extending from Greece to Asia Minor and Syria, Antony now commanded much of the territory adjacent to Egypt. He summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, in modern-day southern Turkey, ostensibly to answer charges that she had failed to support Rome's war against Brutus and Cassius. But both leaders knew this summons was about far more than a formal inquiry. It was a political audition, an opportunity to forge a mutually beneficial alliance. Cleopatra recognized the stakes immediately. Antony was not only one of the most powerful men in Rome, he was also Caesar's loyal friend and a deeply ambitious commander in search of resources, ships, and legitimacy. Cleopatra responded not with submission, but with spectacle. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge coated in gold, with sails of purple silk and silver oars that moved rhythmically to music. She reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and nymphs. Perfumes filled the air. The display was not merely theatrical, it was political. Cleopatra was asserting her command of wealth, divinity, and diplomacy. Antony, known for his admiration of Hellenistic grandeur and his own reputation for indulgence, was immediately captivated. Their meeting at Tarsus quickly evolved into both a personal romance and a political pact. Cleopatra invited Antony to Alexandria, where she hosted him with elaborate banquets, games, and philosophical discussions. Together, they formed what became known as the Inimitable Livers, a private society dedicated to pleasure, artistic expression, and intellectual exploration. While Roman sources later mocked this as excessive decadence, it was a deliberate effort by Cleopatra to create a court that blended culture and power, pleasure and politics. Alexandria, under her guidance, became a kind of Eastern counter-Rome, a cosmopolitan rival court infused with ancient prestige and contemporary ambition. For Cleopatra, the alliance with Antony offered security against Roman aggression and the promise of influence in Mediterranean affairs. She provided him with money, ships, and military support. In return, Antony confirmed her rule over Egypt and granted her new territories, including portions of Syria, Cyprus, Crete, and areas along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. These territories, historically disputed or semi-autonomous, greatly expanded Cleopatra's domain and revived the vision of a Hellenistic empire centered on Egypt. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy, Alexander Aelios, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene. Their names, rich in symbolic meaning, were part of Cleopatra's continued use of dynastic imagery to legitimize her rule. Aelios, meaning sun, and Selene, meaning moon, reflected her association with divine cosmic forces. She now had not only a son by Caesar, Caesar Ion, but two children by Antony, further intertwining her dynasty with Rome's ruling elite. Meanwhile, the Roman world was still in flux. Antony returned to Italy to confront tensions with his fellow triumvir, Octavian. To secure a fragile truce, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor, in 40 BCE. This marriage was a diplomatic necessity but did little to diminish his connection to Cleopatra. He returned to her in 37 BCE after tensions with Octavian once again escalated. Back in Alexandria, Antony resumed his life with Cleopatra, and their political and personal partnership deepened. Cleopatra, now in her early 30s, ruled Egypt at the height of her power. Her kingdom had been expanded, her children had been placed in positions of prominence, and she had the open support of one of Rome's leading generals. She continued to govern efficiently, investing in infrastructure, securing trade routes, and promoting agriculture. The Nile flooded consistently during these years, bringing prosperity to the countryside. Cleopatra's popularity among the Egyptian people remained strong, bolstered by her religious patronage and her public appearances as Isis. To the east, however, whispers of discontent grew louder. Roman observers and propagandists, particularly those aligned with Octavian, began portraying Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign temptress who had bewitched Antony and threatened Roman values. They accused her of using sex and sorcery to manipulate Roman politics, of corrupting Antony, and of plotting to elevate Caesar Ion as Caesar's true heir. These depictions were exaggerated and deeply rooted in Roman xenophobia and misogyny, but they proved politically effective. Still, in this moment, Cleopatra held firm. Her partnership with Antony was based not only on affection but on shared political interests. Together, they envisioned a future in which Rome's eastern provinces were governed in harmony with Egypt, with their children inheriting a legacy that bridged continents and civilizations. Cleopatra had survived assassination plots, palace intrigue, Roman civil wars, and dynastic rivalries. Now, she stood as a queen beside a general, one of the few women in ancient history to command both symbolic power and real political authority on an international scale. Yet even as Cleopatra built a kingdom of stability and vision, storm clouds were gathering in the west. Octavian, shrewd and relentless, was preparing his case against Antony and Cleopatra. Their love story was becoming a weapon in a propaganda war, and the coming years would test the strength of their alliance and determine the fate of the ancient world's last great queen. 9. Political and military partnership, 37 to 34 BCE. By 37 BCE, Mark Antony had returned to Alexandria with full intent to anchor his eastern command in Cleopatra's court. The fragile alliance with Octavian had once again unraveled. The marriage to Octavia had served its temporary purpose but had not resolved the growing rivalry between the two men. Antony, increasingly alienated from Rome's traditional power structures, leaned more heavily on Cleopatra, not only for resources but for legitimacy, vision, and strategic support. This renewed partnership marked the beginning of a bolder and more assertive phase in Cleopatra's reign. Together, Antony and Cleopatra initiated a series of political maneuvers that aimed to reconfigure the power balance of the Mediterranean. Antony formally transferred territories to Cleopatra and her children, effectively expanding the Egyptian-controlled region into parts of Phoenicia, Cilicia, Crete, Cyrenaica, and large swaths of Syria. These grants, while politically motivated, were rooted in both realpolitik and historical precedent. Cleopatra presented them as restorations of territories once ruled by her Ptolemaic ancestors, reinforcing a narrative of imperial revival. In a highly orchestrated event in 34 BCE known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra appeared in full regalia before the citizens of Alexandria. It was a display of power, pageantry, and political theatre unmatched in the ancient world. Antony, seated beside Cleopatra on golden thrones, announced the division of the Eastern Empire among their children. Caesar Ion was declared King of Kings and rightful heir of Julius Caesar. Alexander Aelios was given Armenia and the lands to the east, while Cleopatra Selene was granted Cyrenaica and Crete. The infant Ptolemy Philadelphus, their youngest son, received Syria and Asia Minor. These announcements carried more than symbolic weight, they were a direct challenge to Roman authority. Cleopatra was no longer presenting herself merely as a regional monarch under Roman patronage but as a sovereign empress of a revived Eastern Empire. The ceremony was a declaration of independence wrapped in imperial spectacle. By crowning their children with titles that traditionally belonged to Rome, Antony and Cleopatra provoked outrage among the Roman elite. Octavian, who had remained in Italy building his base of support, seized upon this opportunity. He began a systematic propaganda campaign to portray Antony as a traitor and Cleopatra as a foreign corrupter. Roman poets, pamphleteers, and politicians spread lurid rumors. Antony had become a slave to Cleopatra's charms. He had abandoned Roman virtues for Eastern decadence. He had allowed a foreign queen to dictate Roman policy. The donations were depicted not as diplomatic strategy, but as evidence of Antony's treason. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra remained undeterred. She continued to strengthen Egypt's economy, military, and regional influence. She issued new coinage featuring both her image and Antony's, a visual assertion of shared rule. The coins were widely circulated in the eastern provinces, a reminder that political power was no longer centered solely in Rome. Cleopatra also expanded Egypt's military capability, fortifying naval bases, increasing fleet production, and ensuring that her forces could supplement Antony's legions when necessary. Despite these preparations, Antony's military ventures began to falter. His campaign in Parthia, undertaken to avenge Crassus's humiliating defeat at Carrhae, ended in failure. Although Cleopatra had supplied funding and troops for the expedition, Antony returned in 36 BCE without achieving his objectives. The loss weakened his position, but Cleopatra remained loyal. Rather than abandoning him in political vulnerability, she welcomed him back to Alexandria and reinforced their alliance through ceremonial triumphs and public appearances. The bond between Antony and Cleopatra was now not merely strategic but deeply entrenched in their vision of a shared empire. Their children were growing into symbolic heirs, their coins circulated as evidence of dual authority, and their court had become a center of cultural and diplomatic exchange. Alexandria rivaled Rome in magnificence and purpose. Still, the tension with Octavian was becoming unavoidable. The Roman Senate, heavily influenced by Octavian's rhetoric, stripped Antony of his consulship and prepared for war. In 32 BCE, Octavian seized Antony's will, either by theft or political maneuvering, and read it aloud to the Senate. In it, Antony allegedly acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's true heir, promised vast gifts to Cleopatra and her children, and requested burial in Alexandria beside her. The revelation stunned the Roman public and fueled the fire of war. The Senate formally declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This was a critical distinction. Octavian framed the coming conflict not as a civil war but as a defense of Rome against a foreign monarch. Cleopatra, once again, had become the focal point of Roman anxiety and ambition. But unlike previous moments, she no longer stood alone. She was now part of a royal and military alliance rooted in shared power, blood, and empire. As the drums of war grew louder, Cleopatra prepared for the confrontation that would determine the fate of her kingdom, her children, and the ancient world itself. 10. The final war with Rome, 32 to 31 BCE. As Octavian built momentum for war in Rome, Cleopatra and Antony braced for the inevitable confrontation. By mid-32 BCE, political diplomacy had all but collapsed. Rome was no longer debating, it was mobilizing. Cleopatra, officially named the enemy of the Roman state, was portrayed as the central threat to the Republic. Octavian framed the war not as a contest for succession but as a patriotic campaign to free Rome from the corrupting influence of a foreign queen. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, and it worked. The Senate, manipulated by Octavian's allies, rallied the Roman public around the idea that the Republic's survival depended on Cleopatra's defeat. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony began preparing for war. Both understood the magnitude of what was coming. This was not a regional dispute or a dynastic quarrel, it was a struggle for supremacy across the entire Mediterranean. Cleopatra committed Egypt's full resources to the effort. She financed the construction of ships, fortified key ports, and stocked supplies in strategic coastal cities. Her fleet, one of the largest in the region, would be essential to any confrontation with Rome's powerful navy. Antony, for his part, attempted to consolidate his forces in Greece. He positioned his fleet along the western coast of the Peloponnese and established his base of operations in Actium, a small promontory near the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf. The location provided strategic access to the Ionian Sea and served as a staging ground for the coming engagement with Octavian's forces. Cleopatra accompanied him there, bringing not only troops and ships, but also a treasury large enough to fund an extended campaign. However, their coalition faced problems from the outset. Many of Antony's Roman allies had begun to question his judgment and resented Cleopatra's influence in military decisions. Commanders loyal to Rome defected to Octavian's side, while others hesitated to support what was increasingly seen as a foreign war. Morale faltered as the months dragged on. Cleopatra tried to maintain discipline among the Egyptian squadrons, but the fragmentation among Antony's officers undermined unity. Meanwhile, Octavian's navy, led by the brilliant Admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, executed a series of devastating raids on Antony's supply lines, cutting off grain shipments and pressuring key ports in western Greece. By late summer of 31 BCE, the situation had grown desperate. With famine looming and disease spreading in their coastal encampments, Antony and Cleopatra were forced to act. On September 2, 31 BCE, their combined fleet met Octavian's forces in what would become one of the most consequential naval engagements in history, the Battle of Actium. The fleet commanded by Antony and Cleopatra included around 230 ships, many of them large quinqueremes and hexas, massive warships that dwarfed the lighter, faster vessels of Octavian's fleet. Cleopatra's flagship was richly adorned, bearing Egyptian and Hellenistic symbols of divine authority, and she personally commanded part of the Egyptian navy. Despite the size and power of their ships, Antony's forces were less maneuverable and hampered by conflicting chains of command. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's tactical genius, executed a tight blockade and used superior agility to exploit gaps in Antony's formation. During the thick of the battle, as chaos gripped both fleets, Cleopatra made a decisive move. Interpreting the situation as unwinnable, or following a prearranged strategy, she suddenly sailed her ships out of the battle and fled south with the Egyptian squadron. Antony, seeing her retreat, broke from the fight and followed her, abandoning the majority of his fleet and army. The impact was catastrophic. The remainder of Antony's fleet was overwhelmed or surrendered. Thousands of soldiers deserted. The image of Antony fleeing the battlefield with Cleopatra cemented Octavian's portrayal of him as a man corrupted and emasculated by a foreign queen. In Rome, poets and politicians seized on the moment to ridicule him, framing the loss not as a military defeat, but as the final act of a tragic love story gone wrong. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Egypt in humiliation. Alexandria, once the seat of an ascendant Eastern empire, was now a city under siege in all but name. Cleopatra retreated to her palace to regroup. Antony withdrew into isolation, overcome with despair. The twin thrones they had constructed, elaborate, golden, and once symbolic of dominion over East and West, now stood as reminders of a collapsing dream. Still, Cleopatra did not abandon her cause. She sent envoys to negotiate with Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of her sons if Egypt were allowed to remain independent. Octavian rejected the proposal. He wanted total submission and viewed Caesar Ion as a threat to his own position as Caesar's heir. With her options narrowing, Cleopatra began preparing for the defense of Alexandria, knowing that Octavian's forces would arrive before the year's end. The dream of a joint Hellenistic Roman Empire led by Cleopatra and Antony had ended in failure. But Cleopatra's determination did not waver. In the face of looming conquest, she returned to the skills that had sustained her from the beginning: diplomacy, strategy, and survival. The war was not yet over, and though her army had been shattered and her partner undone, Cleopatra remained queen. For now. 11. Collapse and the Siege of Alexandria, 30 BCE. As 30 BCE dawned, the once glorious capital of Alexandria prepared for the inevitable. Octavian's legions were advancing from the east, sweeping through the remaining territories loyal to Antony. Defections multiplied, supply routes collapsed, and morale within the Ptolemaic court deteriorated. Antony, broken in both spirit and reputation, could no longer command the respect of his troops. Cleopatra, however, remained active, working feverishly to preserve her kingdom through negotiation, subterfuge, and, if necessary, one final act of defiance. With Antony effectively sidelined, Cleopatra turned to the last tools of statecraft she had. She began sending envoys to Octavian, offering generous concessions in exchange for the safety of her children and the survival of Egypt's autonomy. Some accounts suggest she offered her royal treasury, Egypt's grain reserves, or even her own suicide, if Octavian would allow Caesar Ion to rule. She may have even proposed a personal alliance, presenting herself as a potential ally or consort to Rome's new master. Octavian, now a calculated and ruthless statesman, ignored or rebuffed each overture. His objective was clear: total conquest. He had no interest in a political arrangement. Cleopatra, once a formidable player on the Mediterranean chessboard, was now a piece to be removed. Caesarion's claim to Julius Caesar's lineage made him especially dangerous. To secure his future position as sole heir to Caesar's legacy, Octavian needed both Cleopatra and Caesar Ion eliminated from the political equation. Meanwhile, Antony's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Shunned by his officers, isolated from decision-making, and tormented by guilt over action, he became increasingly withdrawn. As Octavian's troops approached Alexandria, Antony made one final attempt to rally his forces. It failed. Desertions decimated his ranks. On August 1, 30 BCE, hearing false rumors that Cleopatra had taken her own life, Antony stabbed himself with his own sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. He was brought, bleeding and in agony, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her closest attendants. The scene was both tragic and symbolic. Cleopatra reportedly had Antony hoisted into the mausoleum through a window, where he died in her arms. The man who had once ruled half the Roman world, now mortally wounded and disgraced, found his final refuge beside the queen who had been his partner in ambition and defeat. Cleopatra, faced with the irreversible collapse of her dynasty, refused to surrender on Octavian's terms. Octavian entered Alexandria days later. The city did not resist. Its garrison, demoralized and outnumbered, surrendered without significant bloodshed. Octavian seized control of the palace, the treasury, and the harbor. He had Cleopatra placed under guard but permitted her a brief audience. According to Roman sources, he found her defiant but composed, dressed in her finest robes, seated on a golden throne, refusing to show submission. The details of their conversation remain unclear. Cleopatra likely pleaded for the safety of her children. She may have asked for permission to arrange her own death rather than suffer the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a captive. Octavian refused, assuring her that she would be treated with dignity if she accompanied him to Rome. But Cleopatra understood what that meant. She had witnessed the fates of defeated rulers before, paraded, mocked, and then executed in Roman triumphs. She had no intention of allowing that fate to befall her. On August 1230 BCE, Cleopatra took her own life. The method remains one of history's great mysteries. Roman authors popularized the story that she used an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figures. Others suggest she used poison concealed in a hairpin or vial. However she died, the act was a final assertion of agency. Cleopatra would not be marched in chains through the streets of her enemy. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, aware of the optics, the message, and the legacy. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, was both relieved and cautious. He buried Cleopatra and Antony together, honoring her final request. The tomb was grand and ceremonial, a nod to their former stature. But he took no chances with their lineage. Caesar Ion, who had been sent south, possibly toward Nubia, was captured en route and executed shortly after. Octavian is reported to have said, "Too many Caesars is not good," a chilling justification for removing the last dynastic threat to his power. Cleopatra's remaining children, Alexander Aelios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph but spared execution. Eventually, they were placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister. Cleopatra Selene would later marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a North African client kingdom of Rome. Through her, some trace the final flickers of the Ptolemaic line. The siege of Alexandria marked the end of an era. With Cleopatra's death, the Hellenistic world that had begun with Alexander the Great was extinguished. Egypt, once a sovereign and ancient civilization ruled by its own divine monarchs, was annexed into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, was gone. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph, his final rival eliminated, his power secure. The woman who had ruled Egypt for over 2 decades, faced down 2 Roman civil wars, and partnered with the 2 greatest generals of her time had made her last move. Her empire crumbled, her children captured, her legacy contested, but Cleopatra's legend had only just begun. Thank you for watching. Clapperboard here are 2 other videos you might enjoy. Julius Caesar, the fall of the Roman Republic. Mark Antony, Rome's most tragic commander,